Welcome to Defense Priorities video series reviewing the newly released National Defense Strategy. I'm Jennifer Kavanagh, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, and I'll be breaking down the NDS with leading defense and foreign policy experts. We'll discuss what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and what it means for restraint and U.S. grand strategy. In this episode, I'm joined by Dan Caldwell, a former Pentagon advisor and senior fellow for foreign policy at American Moment. We're going to be discussing what it will take to implement the NDS and what comes next. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My first question for you is, now that we have the National Defense Strategy, we all waited for it. It felt like with a lot of anticipation. It's now out. What does the administration and the Pentagon specifically need to do over the next coming weeks and months to signal to allies and partners, as well as observers within the United States, that this strategy actually will guide U.S. defense policy going forward?
Well, this is a good question. So following the release of this document, there should be several follow-on processes and ultimately production of additional documents to help ensure that the National Defense Strategy is properly implemented. I think we're going to get into this, but it's important to note that there are going to be a lot of internal barriers, not just within the Department of Defense, but elsewhere in government and outside to actually implementing this document. But following this, there should be the production of what's known as the National Military Strategy. And this is simply how the joint force, so the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Space Force, is actually going to implement the National Defense Strategy and achieve the goals laid out in there. So the way to think of it is, this is the how the military is going to accomplish the ends set out in the National Defense Strategy. In parallel to this, and I believe this has been going on for a few months already, is there should be a larger global force posture review going on, assessing America's global military footprint and ensuring whether or not it tiers up into the National Defense Strategy. In addition, we're entering budget season. The administration is going to release its budget proposal, and those budget proposals are almost never fully implemented by Congress, but it's going to reveal how the administration is thinking about investing in the military and how it's going to invest in certain capabilities to meet the goals laid out in the National Defense Strategy. So those are the things that should be happening over the next weeks and months. This administration does a lot of things differently. There's no guarantee that they'll follow that sequencing, or whether or not certain documents will follow a certain order of production or things of that nature. But that's normally how things are done following the release of the National Defense Strategy.
Well, that's a really great explanation for the next steps for the Pentagon. For an outside observer, what should we be looking for if we want to assess the extent to which the National Defense Strategy is actually guiding policy, or where the administration might be making revisions along the way, which is certainly something that most administrations have to do just as world events intervene? What are the types of signals or signs we should be looking for, whether it's in the budget or force posture moves or other types of signs that people should be on the lookout for?
Now, for me, and Jennifer, you may disagree, smarter minds may disagree, but for me, the biggest sign of whether or not the National Defense Strategy is being implemented is our global force posture. So within the National Defense Strategy, it makes clear what our priorities are. First and foremost, our backyard in the Western Hemisphere, but then the Indo-Pacific, and it also makes clear that in Europe and the Middle East, that we're looking to shift more of the burden to partners. Now, in my mind, shifting the burden shifting is different from burden sharing. And that a true burden shift would mean that we would withdraw forces, first and foremost, I think, from Europe, but also from the Middle East, as partners step up in the region. If we see that happening, if we see a further drawdown of U.S. forces in Europe, and late last year, there was a withdrawal of a rotational brigade from Romania and from Eastern Europe that was deployed following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was an announcement that the rotational deployment of several fighter squadrons would end. If we see more of those types of actions being taken in Europe, and we see similar actions taken in the Middle East, that would be, in my mind, the biggest sign that the administration is actually going to follow through with its priorities laid out in the national defense strategy. And I also think, too, on the budget side, how the administration proposes dividing up the defense budget is going to be very revealing. Now, in my opinion, and again, others may disagree with me, is that the national defense strategy in some ways should be the naval defense strategy, because in my view, the United States Navy is the critical service, and really has been since our founding. Again, in the Constitution, it's provide and maintain a Navy, raise an Army. Going back to our founding, the Navy has been incredibly important. And so we want to see the Navy really taking the top billing in terms of investments within the defense budget. And if there is a budget increase, we can debate the need for that. But if there is, the hope would be is that those are investing in fixing our shipbuilding and building a better Navy. And I'd follow that with the Air Force and other long-range strike capabilities as well too. And then looking at certain investments within the Army and Navy that are more geared towards not these larger, massive deployments to places like Europe and the Middle East, but to actually building, more expeditionary, smaller, in my mind, smaller forces that could be moved around more easily, and that would be focused more on what you would need in the Pacific or here in the Western Hemisphere, as opposed to fighting a massive land war in Europe, for example. So I think those are the things that you should look for to see how the administration is looking at implementing national defense strategy, and if they're able to overcome resistance from certain segments of the United States government and the foreign policy establishment.
So this question of resistance is a really interesting one that you just brought up. This is a very different national defense strategy than we've seen in the past, in certain ways, not in all ways, but in some ways. What would you say are the major differences in how the current administration is thinking about the national defense strategy, and how does that come through in this document?
Well, I think you actually have to start with, and we haven't talked about this document yet, the national security strategy, which is the first in the series of documents that comes out. And that laid out the overall foreign policy vision for the Trump administration. I think I've said that was in a lot of ways a very straightforward and what should not be radical document, but is actually radical because it was a break with 30 years of foreign policy precedent. It made very clear that the goal of the United States is no longer pursuing liberal hegemony or primacy. And so that was really a break with the Cold War foreign policy consensus. And the national defense strategy as a break from what you've seen over really the last 20 years in terms of how it's viewing the priorities for the United States military, how it's viewing threats from Russia. I think one of the most surprising parts of the national defense strategy was how they, and I thought this was great, how they talked about China. They weren't looking to preordain conflict with China. As the language was about, there are real challenges posed by China, but it is not in our interest to have a war. And so we're looking for a decent peace is the term that is getting thrown around a lot. And so I think that there are a lot of people within the permanent national security bureaucracy, and I'll talk about what that means in a second here, but also the larger foreign policy establishment, as Ben Rhodes calls them, the blob, but also Congress, that very much do not agree with that overall framing of American foreign policy, nor the prioritization that the national defense strategy lays out. And so the permanent national security bureaucracy is, and again, other people may have different definitions, but to me, that is your group of civilian career employees at the Department of State, Department of Defense, and your career military officers, not guys that or gals that go in and spend 4 or 6 years in enlistment or as an officer, or maybe serve some time in the National Guard and Reserves. These are your career military officers, the people that occupy the highest ranks in the United States military. Is that for various reasons, those groups of people, and I want to be clear, they're not all bad or evil, but they're very much invested in preserving the status quo. And that's because they've come up in through certain career and professional development pipelines. They're area specialists, and they're invested in preserving a certain focus, a certain amount of investment in certain parts of the world. And they are resistant to deprioritize things like Europe, or to pursue a negotiated settlement to the Russian-Ukraine war, or potentially reconfiguring the United States relationship with Russia and China as well too. And so they are in many cases going to look to resist any changes to American foreign policy. And the question is how do they do that? Well, they have a number of different ways, but I think the biggest way is that a lot of them think that they can just outweight an administration. Is that if there's a policy they don't like, they can just slow roll it through the bureaucratic processes, and then the administration will change in 4 or 8 years. And ultimately, there won't be a radical change in American foreign policy. And then they also get help from another group in this, in this goal, and that is from Congress. And Congress, particularly on the Republican side, but also on the Democrat side, is that they still very much believe that the United States foreign policy should be focused on pursuing primacy, that America needs to lead the world. We need to lead this rules-based international order, and they will do things through the budgetary process, through the National Defense Authorization Act, and other legislative vehicles to try and impede this administration from changing American foreign true drastically. And you already saw this with the National Defense Authorization Act, where they tried to inhibit withdrawal of troops from Europe, from other parts of the world, try to force the United States to continue to provide certain weapons to Ukraine. And so you already see this playing out. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important to remember, is that whether you agree or disagree with these documents, and I think the national security strategy and national defense strategy are overall very good, they're going to run into a lot of resistance from groups of individuals that have been shown themselves very adept over the past few decades of inhibiting reform and change to American foreign policy.
So outside of this internal resistance, my last question is just what kind of black swan events in the world could force the administration to change its strategy or deviate from what it's laid out, right? The famous example here is, a lot of the strategic planning documents in the George W. Bush administration were finished right before 9/11, and then they were totally irrelevant and had to be thrown out. So what are the types of things that might derail this administration's effort to implement the NSS and the NDS as articulated?
Well, I think you don't have to look back very far. You could look back to the Biden administration, where the Russian invasion of Ukraine caused them to completely rewrite the national security strategy. And I also believe the national defense strategy as a result. And then even after that, you had former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan write this piece for Foreign Affairs talking about how the Middle East is quieter than it's ever been. And I believe a week later, October 7th happened. And so there are, to quote a former Secretary of Defense, not a good one, Don Rumsfeld, saying there's a lot of unknown unknowns. And as we sit here today, there is escalating tensions in the Middle East with Iran. Just prior to recording, there was news that U.S. naval fighter aircraft shot down an Iranian drone that got too close to the Lincoln Carrier battle group. That could lead to escalation. That could lead to a situation where there's a war with Iran that could cause the region to become more chaotic, which would make withdrawals from that region and deprioritize it much more difficult.
Yeah.
And so no plan, the military likes to say, no plan survives the first contact. And that applies to these strategy documents. And we've seen that play out time and again over the past few decades.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that, I don't know, pessimistic or note, but hopefully we can avoid things that force us to deviate in ways that are not aligned with the direction that we'd like to see U.S. foreign policy move. But thanks so much, Dan, for joining us today. And to everyone else, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series.